Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to my world of stocks. Gonna have a little bit of perhaps maybe a little controversial of a video today. I hope that's not the case. I hope I don't offend anybody. As always, I try to never give any kind of political, views or bias or opinion or anything like that. It's not my intention at all with this channel. But I did just have someone recently, a viewer, ask me for my thoughts on what a Kamala Harris presidency would look like for the economy and whether I think it could potentially even crash the stock market, which is something that a few analysts have been kind of speculating about recently. I'll show you what they had to say a little later in the video, but it's also related to her tax policies, which have even drawn the attention of Mark Cuban, one of her biggest supporters, who even he said that taxing unrealized capital gains would probably kill the market. And I'll explain all of that a little later. But just so you know, taxing unrealized capital gains, that's basically when an investor owns an asset like a stock too. And if that value goes up, then they get taxed on it even if they didn't sell it. So it would be just for owning it, they would get taxed on it. This is a policy for the very rich, though, targeted towards them. I'll explain all of this a little later in the video, but it's something that has just kind of gained a lot of attention in the media and on social media. A lot of people are kind of talking about it. So anyway, this viewer asked me to share my thoughts. Again, I don't like being biased. I don't like giving political views and stuff like that. So I'm also going to address this with Trump as well. I'm just going to kind of break down what the chances are that either Kamala or Trump could potentially crash the stock market if elected based on a few different things. Now, again, I promise to be as unbiased as possible. I hate talking about politics. I'm an independent myself, and I think everyone should do their own research and make their own decisions. As always, I always preach that to you guys on this channel. So I'm not going to try to convince you to vote one way or another. It's not at all what I plan to do here with my channel. I'm just going to talk about some of the differences between these two candidates and give my opinion on whether either one could damage the stock market. Sound good? All right, let's go ahead and dive into it. Now, the good thing about this election cycle this time around is that it makes it much easier really to evaluate the two candidates when it comes to the economy and the stock market, because we've actually already seen their performances as Trump held presidency, of course, from 2016 to 2020, while Kamala served as vice president under Joe Biden from then on. So, really something that a lot of people are saying is that this is really an election here that basically comes down to which one of them you preferred living under as an American, which kind of time period or their policies, like which one. You kind of got a taste of both, right? So you kind of just have to decide which one you liked the most, which one you preferred the most. And so with that in mind, I think there's two specific ways that we can kind of speculate on how they might impact the economy and the stock market. We're not going over social stuff. We're not going over, all the, kind of craziness or drama or anything else. We're just talking about economy and stock market as investors, right? Now, one thing that we can do, so there's two specific ways that I think we can kind of speculate on how they might impact the economy and the stock market. One is to just simply look at their track records, and the other one is to look at their upcoming policies that they hope to implement in another term. Okay, so we had their previous term, and then we have an upcoming term. We can look at the track record. We can look at what they hope to do in the next term. Okay, well, starting with their track records first to see how well everything went during those two different time periods and how the economy and the stock market performed. Was there any major drops or crashes, or was everything just mostly good? Well, it's actually a little harder to say than you might think, because it really depends a little bit on how you look at things. Like, for example, when looking at Trump, and again, just want to remind you, trying to be very unbiased here, I'm even going to give the benefit of the doubt to both candidates. I'm assuming they genuinely wanted to help the country in whatever way they thought was best. But when looking at Trump, well, I would say that the economy did very well under the circumstances during his presidency up until the pandemic, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a second. But when we look at it, well, some of the key initiatives from the Trump administration focused around tax cuts for everyone, really, including not just regular people, but also for giant corporations, as well as trade tariffs on foreign countries. For example, Trump issued the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2018, which included some of the biggest changes to the tax code in many decades. Keep in mind, though, that it's set to expire in 2025 when a new president will have already been elected. So that's an important date to take note of, too. We'll come back to that a little later. But there are really these and other initiatives that ultimately were, I would say, a net positive for the economy, which expanded to a 3% GDP growth rate in 2018, the highest level of growth since even before the Great Recession. Ultimately, that did come crashing down when the pandemic hit, but again, talk more about that in just a second. As for unemployment, that also fell to the lowest levels since the 1960s under Trump, and even hourly wages saw a notable growth as well during that time. Of course, when the pandemic hit though, everything changed, and here's where it gets a little tricky deciding on whose policies were better, because if you believe that the pandemic was an extremely serious health concern, then you agree with all of the lockdowns, the shutting down of businesses, and all the money that was created that led to now giant inflation. But you might feel that that was necessary, which is understandable if that's the viewpoint that you have. However, if you disagree with all of that, then you might feel that these policies were insane and they led to the biggest transfer of wealth from regular people and small businesses to giant corporations, leaving us now with crippling inflation and high interest rates to combat that. Regardless though, the pandemic years started under Trump and were finished ultimately under Kamala. So how did the numbers look during that time? Well, of course, we saw a giant crash in the economy with an equally giant recovery right after. Unemployment eventually dropped back down, which Trump argues were bounce back jobs from the pandemic, but Kamala touts them as improvements that she and Biden made to help the economy, notably through their Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, which was the largest spending bill in decades that authorized $1.2 trillion in spending, with an additional $800 billion for semiconductor and climate change investments. I personally prefer tax cuts over giant spending, but arguments can be made for both under different circumstances, right? I will just say though that our deficit is incredibly high right now too, and when we go over their future policies, well, that spending is going to matter, I would say, a bit more. So we'll talk about that too in just a second. As far as the stock market is concerned though, here's the yearly growth rates per year for the S&P 500, and we can see that just right before Trump took office, the market was actually negative in 2015, but then it rose by almost a double-digit rate in 2016, then soared by another 19% gains in 2017 before correcting a bit in 2018 by -6%, which as PBS points out, it had largely to do with Trump's trade war with China, as well as a global economic slowdown and the Fed raising interest rates too quickly. However, from that dip, the market proceeded to skyrocket the following year by 29%, one of the best years ever. And then it still managed to grow another 16% in 2020, despite the pandemic crash early in that year. As for Kamala though, well, the market continued to perform well, especially considering the massive challenges from the pandemic, as it soared by nearly 27% in 2021. That was, of course, thanks to all the stimulus that got pumped into the economy. But then it did ultimately crash in 2022, coming off of that, falling by almost 20% as inflation and interest rates started to take their toll. But then, to their credit, well, the market actually bounced back by over 24% in 2023 and is already up another 17% so far this year, reaching new record highs along the way. So really, I would say both candidates actually did very well in their own right, at least when it comes to the stock market, with both seeing notable drops, but also seeing strong overall performance and reaching new record highs. And so the reality is that based on track record alone, I don't think that the market is going to be overly worried. I think both politicians showed that they would implement policies that really help big businesses in the end, especially those that make up the majority of the market. However, I will also note that more recently, well, inflation and interest rates do continue to weigh on consumers very heavily, which could actually crash the economy and the stock market. Because you look at it here, and we still have ridiculous inflation, which, by the way, even though the growth of that inflation has come down, inflation is cumulative. And I know the media hates to tell you that. They hate to show you the truth about that. But inflation is cumulative, meaning that we are still paying way higher prices today than before the pandemic. So consumers are absolutely still hurting. And that really shows in virtually any poll you look at. You look at any kind of consumer polls, it shows that consumers are worried about the economy, and even businesses have said all along that they've been actively preparing for a recession as well. So things are not as good, I would say, as it may appear. And while unemployment has improved since the pandemic years, it's also upticked a bit more recently, while interest rates continue to linger at some of the highest levels in a very long time, which does threaten, again, a recession. So, is the stock market breaking new highs? Yes, it is. Has Kamala been good for the stock market? I would say yes, she has. But is the economy doing well right now? The economy at large? My opinion, I would say no, it's not doing well. And there's a large disconnect, I would also say, between the stock market and the economy that does worry me. Now, having said that, how do the two candidates' policies differ, and how might that help or maybe even hurt this already very fragile economy that we're currently in right now? Well, a Trump presidency would likely focus once again on tax cuts, trade tariffs, energy independence, which was started under his first term, and also securing the border, which I think are very pro-economy policies overall. However, I will note again that the market did dip in 2018 from all the trade tensions with China. So just saying that a Trump presidency would boost the economy and the stock market might not be taking into account the unpredictability of Trump, who tends to be very firm on global economic policy. Now, you can have your own opinions on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but the point is that there could be some pushback by other nations or even domestic politicians, that many of which, by the way, as you probably know, hate Trump. A lot of politicians hate Trump. A lot of people, he's a very kind of, polarizing figure, right? And a lot of politicians would also love to vote against him in the House and the Senate, and thus perhaps hurting his vision for the economy, even if it's a good one, right? It could be good, could be bad, but regardless, there could be some tensions there and some pushback. And all of this is really to say, of course, that a Trump presidency could involve an element of unpredictability that the market doesn't like to see, thus causing some volatility. I don't think it'd be to the level of a market crash, like a big one, but just keep in mind that the market has always hated uncertainty. So some might argue that a more established politician like maybe Biden or Kamala would be easier to predict how they're going to act and their policies and all that kind of stuff, just kind of keeping the status quo going, which is something that the market might actually like. And yet, surprisingly, Kamala is actually pushing for some pretty large changes when it comes to her economic policies. Now, a lot of it is the same stuff that you would expect from a Democrat, right? Like various stimulus for the poor, including bigger earned income tax deductions, child tax deductions for families, more medical care availability, that kind of stuff, rent control, and even special incentives like a $25,000 down payment for first-time home buyers. These are things that Kamala is pushing very heavily. However, it also includes some very large tax increases that analysts worry could hurt the market. For example, she plans to raise the capital gains tax from 23% up to 28%, as well as the corporate tax rate from 21% up to 28% as well. Although she does promise not to raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. In the past, though, Kamala has also supported several progressive tax programs, like co-sponsoring a bill with Bernie Sanders to expand Social Security by increasing the tax rate on investments. And in 2019, she supported an even higher corporate tax rate of as much as 35%. Even at the lower 28%, though, analysts from Goldman Sachs predict that earnings of S&P 500 companies would likely take a 5% hit under Kamala, while instead gaining a 4% boost under Trump's policies. Under Kamala, though, analysts predict lower corporate profits, resulting in lower stock valuations, saying that the market would likely experience a significant pullback under those higher taxes. And this is something that has been echoed by Goldman Sachs, UBS, other analysts too. Now, on the other hand, Kamala's campaign argues that Trump's proposal would really only give massive tax windfalls to the billionaires and the big corporations, which doesn't end up helping the underlying consumers that really power the economy, right? Which some of that is probably true, right? Given that really under his presidency, Trump not only cut those corporate tax rates from 35% down to 21%, but even now he's also saying that he'd like to reduce them even further, all the way down to just 15%, but for any companies that make their products here in the United States, as that would very likely, at least in my opinion, bring jobs back into the country while also be boosting corporate earnings, which would likely be welcomed by the stock market as well. Going back to Kamala though for a second, before she became vice president, she also stated that she is not a protectionist Democrat and would therefore oppose widespread tariffs, arguing that they contribute to inflation and end up hurting consumers. But later on, she actually maintained all of the Trump tariffs on China and even added tens of billions of dollars more in additional tariffs during the Biden administration. So it's hard to say what she will ultimately do there. There's been kind of some flip-flopping taking place, right? But remember that $2 trillion of spending in that those bills that we talked about earlier? Well, nonpartisan watchdogs say that even her new spending programs will increase the growing federal deficit by more than $1 trillion more over the next decade too. But perhaps most important of all is her support of implementing a wealth tax on any individuals with more than $100 million in total assets, including unrealized gains, something that even Mark Cuban, one of her biggest outspoken supporters, said that it would likely kill the stock market, saying that he's urging Kamala not to go through with them and ultimately thinks that she will not implement the new 25% tax, which, you know, I can actually understand why Cuban says that he doesn't actually expect Kamala to go through with it, because it is such an insane policy to think about, in my opinion. I mean, I just can't see people going along with it. This really doesn't feel like something that would be even socialist Democrat. It really looks like full-on socialist to me. If you're telling people that they need to pay 25% of their assets just for having them, I mean, that is like the literal definition of the government taking other people's money and then redistributing it however they see fit, which is kind of insane to think about, even if it's for the ultra wealthy. I mean, even in that scenario, I would have to imagine that the rich and giant corporations, they could just move overseas. They could move their stuff overseas. They would do everything to avoid it. So you would have like a mass exodus. I don't see why anybody would stay if you have to pay, 25% of your assets. Not to mention how any of the logistics of it all would even work. Because if you like own a stock, for example, and then that stock goes up, and you don't even sell and you just decide to hold on to it, but the government tells you need to pay 25% taxes on it just for holding it, and then that stock, let's say that stock later goes down, then what happens? Like, does the government reimburse you for that? I mean, like, all of it just kind of doesn't make any sense. So it is a very crazy policy. It's not one that I think is very realistic. So it's not something that I would be overly concerned about myself. But, we have seen crazier things happen. The idea that we're even talking about a policy like that is kind of crazy to me. And it kind of worries me about if this could be like a slippery slope, that maybe we go even further than that in the future, or what it could lead to. But again, my opinion is that none of that stuff really would ever happen. I honestly think that sometimes Kamala or other Democrats, maybe progressive ones, just kind of say things to maybe get the headlines or something, but they don't really go through with it in the end, because they know that some things just wouldn't really work in a still, kind of free market capitalistic, country like we have. Anyway, putting that aside for a second, when we look at the overall picture here, what happens under either candidate's policies? Well, personally, I don't think that the market crashes because of either one. I do think that Trump's plans are more like big business friendly, so perhaps that does have a greater impact on the stock market, a positive one. But in terms of Kamala actually crashing the market, as long as she doesn't do anything really crazy like, a tax on unrealized gains, which again, I do not think she's going to do, well, I think the market would perform relatively as usual. That's not to say that the economy would do well, though, in either case. I just don't think that either candidate holds as much power or influence as really what the Fed does, and how soon the Fed starts to cut interest rates, and if it's even soon enough to prevent a recession. And that's a big challenge there that I think either candidate is really going to inherit. But as far as their individual impact, I feel that we've already seen what both presidencies have done economically and as a stock market investor, like, you know, putting social policies aside and all the drama and everything else, and just looking at it economically and in relation to the stock market, I would say Trump's policies are probably more business friendly overall. I mean, you're lowering corporate taxes. How could that not benefit the corporations? How does that not benefit the stock market? So that in itself might be better. But I also don't think that Kamala would be much different than what we saw from Biden, where the market still performed very well, even with all the challenges that they had to deal with during the pandemic. Plus, if the Fed does start to lower rates throughout this next presidency, which is looking very likely, well, that's a gigantic tailwind for the stock market and for both candidates, right? The market almost always rises during a lowering rate environment. So I think both Kamala or Trump would have to push some really disastrous policies in order for them to be able to have more influence over the stock market and actually, you know, go as far as to crash it. Or, of course, if a world war breaks out or we have another pandemic or something else. But just policy-wise, I don't think we'll see enough from either one of them to single-handedly crash the stock market. I think other things would have to be stacked on top of that to cause that kind of effect. But hey, that's just my opinion. All of this was just my opinion, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you got something out of it. But again, all views are welcome here on the channel. Share them down below. Let me know. I love you regardless of whoever you vote for, whatever your ideas are, anything like that. But let me know your thoughts down there. We can have a fun conversation. Try to keep it clean. Try to be nice and respectful to everyone. But yeah, thanks again for stopping by, my friends. I hope you enjoyed the video. And I'll have more videos coming for you in the future too. So make sure you're subscribed. Hit that like button. Really helps me out. But I'll catch you in the next one. All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.